The Harrison family's quiet retirement retreat to northern Thailand was about to transform into the most meaningful experience of their lives when they heard a desperate cry echoing through the morning mist. What started as a peaceful sunrise coffee session at their eco-lodge would lead them to the edge of an abandoned poacher's trap, where a tiny elephant calf fought for survival. But the way this elephant family would thank them afterward would redefine everything they thought they knew about the intelligence and emotional depth of these magnificent creatures. Before we begin this extraordinary tale, let me paint you the scene. The morning sun had just begun to filter through the dense canopy of teak trees and bamboo groves that surrounded the remote eco-lodge where the Harrisons were spending their 2-month Southeast Asian adventure. Robert Harrison, a recently retired bridge engineer from Oregon, sat quietly on the wooden deck with his wife Margaret, a former head nurse who had dedicated 30 years to emergency medicine. Their daughter Jessica, 23, and in her final year of veterinary school, was already up and documenting the incredible biodiversity of this protected forest with her camera. The lodge, perched on stilts above a gentle stream, offered the perfect vantage point to observe the wildlife that emerged in the early hours before the heat became oppressive. Golden langurs swung through branches overhead, while hornbills called out territorial challenges that echoed across the valley. It was exactly the kind of peaceful retreat that Robert and Margaret had dreamed of during those long Oregon winters when retirement seemed impossibly distant. But this particular morning would be anything but peaceful. As Margaret poured fresh coffee from the French press they had brought from home, a sound unlike any they had heard before pierced the forest silence. It wasn't the typical calls of gibbons or the rustle of wild boar foraging below their deck. This was something else entirely, a deep, resonant cry that seemed to carry within it an unmistakable note of distress. Jessica immediately lowered her camera. Having studied animal behavior extensively, she recognized the urgency in that call. It wasn't territorial or mating-related. This was a distress signal, and it was coming from somewhere beyond the bamboo grove that bordered the lodge property. The cry came again, longer this time, and even more plaintive. Then another voice joined it, higher-pitched, younger, and absolutely desperate. Robert set down his coffee and stood, his engineering mind immediately calculating distances and directions. The sounds were coming from the northwest, perhaps half a kilometer through dense forest. The lodge manager had mentioned that this area, while officially protected, still bore scars from decades of illegal logging and poaching activities that had only recently been curtailed. Old traps and snares still posed dangers to the wildlife that was slowly reclaiming the forest. The family exchanged glances. They had come to Thailand seeking tranquility and cultural immersion, not adventure. But there was something about those cries that made ignoring them impossible. Margaret, her 30 years of emergency medicine experience having honed her instincts for crisis situations, was already reaching for their day pack. Jessica was checking her camera equipment and the basic first aid supplies she always carried when studying wildlife. Without needing to discuss it further, the Harrisons found themselves following a narrow game trail that led away from their lodge and into the dense undergrowth. The trail was barely visible, just a slight depression in the forest floor, marked by occasional bent branches and the odd footprint in patches of soft earth. But it clearly led in the direction of those increasingly desperate cries. The forest here was different from the manicured jungle tours they had experienced near Chiang Mai. This was raw wilderness, thick with the kind of biodiversity that takes centuries to develop. Ancient hardwood trees created a canopy so dense that the morning light filtered down in scattered beams, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. Exotic bird calls echoed from every direction, and the air itself seemed alive with the hum of countless insects and the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. As they hiked deeper into the forest, following the increasingly urgent elephant calls, Jessica noticed signs that made her heart sink. Broken branches at about 7 feet high, the right height for an adult elephant pushing through. But more concerning were the older signs: rusted wire partially hidden under fallen leaves, wooden stakes driven into trees, and small clearings that showed evidence of having been used for purposes that had nothing to do with conservation. This area had once been a hunting ground. While those days were officially over, the detritus of that dark period remained scattered throughout the forest like landmines waiting to harm the animals that were trying to reclaim their ancestral home. After nearly 20 minutes of careful hiking, the elephant calls were becoming deafening. But now they could hear something else: multiple elephant voices, all clearly agitated. Robert, drawing on his construction experience with heavy machinery, estimated they were dealing with adult elephants, which could weigh several tons each. If these animals felt threatened, the Harrisons could find themselves in serious danger. But as they crested a small hill and looked down into a natural clearing below, the source of the distress became immediately apparent. In the center of the clearing was a hole, clearly artificial, about 8 feet across and evidently quite deep. The edges were reinforced with stakes, marking it as an old elephant trap that had been disguised and abandoned when the area became protected. And trapped at the bottom was a baby elephant, no more than 8 months old, its tiny trumpeting cries creating the desperate soundtrack they had been following. The calf was clearly exhausted from its efforts to escape, its front legs scraped raw from trying to climb the smooth earthen walls of the trap. But what made the scene even more heartbreaking was the presence of the adult elephants gathered around the hole. A massive female, clearly the mother, paced frantically at the edge of the trap, her trunk exploring every possible angle for a rescue that seemed impossible. 2 other adults, probably aunts or older sisters, stood nearby, their distress obvious in their body language. One kept reaching her trunk down into the hole, trying to offer comfort to the trapped baby, while the other faced outward, ears flared in a protective stance. Margaret gripped Robert's arm as they observed the scene. The baby elephant looked up at its mother with eyes that seemed to hold a desperate trust that somehow, someway, help would come. But the trap had been engineered by humans who understood elephant behavior. The walls were too high and too smooth for even an adult elephant to safely descend, and any attempt to do so would likely result in 2 trapped elephants instead of 1. The mother elephant's distress was palpable. She would approach the edge of the trap, extend her trunk down to touch her baby, then back away and pace, clearly calculating options that didn't exist. Every few minutes, she would test different approaches, trying to find an angle where she might be able to lower herself enough to lift the baby, or searching for branches or logs that might serve as a ramp. But the trap had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of rescue. Jessica, her veterinary training kicking in, used her camera's zoom lens to assess the baby elephant's condition. The calf was clearly dehydrated and exhausted, but still alert and responsive to its mother. Most concerning was what appeared to be an injured front leg, possibly sprained or worse from the fall into the trap or subsequent escape attempts. If they didn't act soon, the situation would become dire. Robert was already calculating. The trap was approximately 8 feet deep and 8 feet across. His experience with construction sites had taught him about emergency rescue protocols, though he had never imagined applying them to wildlife. They had basic rope in their day pack, 30 feet of climbing rope that Robert always carried for emergency situations. But traditional rope rescue techniques wouldn't work here. They needed something that could support the weight of a baby elephant while being gentle enough not to cause additional injuries. Margaret was thinking in medical terms. The baby elephant showed signs of stress and dehydration, but nothing immediately life-threatening if they could effect a rescue quickly. However, every hour that passed would worsen its condition, and the emotional distress of prolonged separation from its mother could have long-term psychological effects, even if they managed a successful physical rescue. The nearest elephant rescue facility was at least 5 hours away through forest roads that were barely passable in dry weather. Even if they could somehow contact authorities, help would not arrive in time. This baby elephant's life depended on their actions in the next few hours. As if sensing the presence of the human family, the mother elephant turned to look directly at them. Robert had expected hostility or defensive aggression. Instead, those ancient, intelligent eyes seemed to assess them with a startling clarity. It was as if she understood that these strange creatures possessed capabilities that her species lacked, the ability to manipulate tools, to problem-solve in ways that might offer solutions she couldn't achieve through raw elephant strength. For nearly a minute, they maintained eye contact across the clearing. Then, in what Robert would later describe as the most remarkable display of interspecies communication he had ever witnessed, the mother elephant deliberately moved away from the trap, positioning herself where she could see both her baby and the human family. Her message seemed clear. She was giving them space to help, trusting these strangers with the most precious thing in her world. Jessica was the first to act. Her veterinary training had included courses on wildlife rescue, and she knew that time was the critical factor. She began unpacking their supplies while explaining her improvised plan. They would need to create some kind of lifting device using their rope and leverage from the trees surrounding the clearing. But more than that, they needed to find a way to secure the baby elephant safely while they lifted it, a task that would require the cooperation of an 8-month-old wild animal that was already traumatized and exhausted. Robert surveyed the trees around the clearing, his engineering mind automatically calculating load-bearing capacities and anchor points. There were several mature teak trees that could easily support the weight they were dealing with, but the challenge would be creating a mechanical advantage that would allow 3 humans to lift several hundred pounds safely. Meanwhile, Margaret was considering the medical implications. They would need to lift the baby elephant without causing additional injury, and they would need to do it quickly enough to minimize stress on both the calf and its mother. Her experience with emergency medicine had taught her that even successful rescues could be traumatic if not handled properly. As they prepared for their rescue attempt, the adult elephants seemed to understand that help was at hand. The mother elephant positioned herself where she could see everything that was happening, while the other 2 adults moved to what appeared to be protective positions around the clearing. But none of them showed aggression toward the humans. Instead, their behavior suggested something almost like supervisory oversight. They were allowing the humans to help, but they were watching carefully to ensure no harm came to the baby. Robert began constructing an improvised pulley system using their climbing rope and a sturdy branch from one of the teak trees. The principle was simple: mechanical advantage through rope and leverage. But the execution would require precision and teamwork. Jessica would need to descend into the trap to secure the baby elephant, while Robert and Margaret operated the lifting system from above. The descent into the trap was the most dangerous part of their plan. Jessica would be sharing a confined space with a frightened wild animal that, despite being young, was still powerful enough to cause serious injury if it panicked. She had experience with domestic animals in distress, but wild elephants were an entirely different challenge. As Jessica prepared for the descent, the mother elephant did something extraordinary. She approached the edge of the trap and made a series of low, rumbling sounds toward her baby. Elephant communication includes infrasonic frequencies below human hearing, but the parts they could hear sounded remarkably soothing. The baby elephant immediately calmed, looking up at its mother with obvious relief. It was as if the mother was explaining to her baby that the humans were there to help. Whatever communication passed between them, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The baby elephant stopped its frantic scrambling and positioned itself in the center of the trap, watching Jessica with curious but calm attention. The descent went smoothly. Jessica found herself face to face with a baby elephant whose eyes showed intelligence and wariness in equal measure. She spoke constantly in soft, soothing tones while examining the calf for injuries. The leg she had been concerned about showed swelling and limited mobility, but nothing that suggested a serious fracture. With careful handling, this was an injury that would heal with time and proper care. Securing the baby elephant for lifting proved to be the most delicate part of the operation. Jessica had improvised a harness using part of their rope, but it required the cooperation of the baby elephant to position it correctly. Here again, the mother elephant's influence seemed crucial. Her continued soft vocalizations kept the baby calm and cooperative, even when Jessica had to manipulate its legs to get the harness properly positioned. The lifting operation itself was a testament to human ingenuity and elephant trust. Robert's pulley system distributed the weight effectively, allowing the three humans to gradually raise the baby elephant from the trap. But the most remarkable aspect was the baby's behavior during the lift. Despite being suspended in an unnatural position by creatures it had never encountered before, it remained calm and still, as if it understood that cooperation was essential for its rescue. When the baby elephant finally reached ground level and Jessica removed the improvised harness, the reunion between mother and baby was something that transcended species boundaries. The mother elephant enveloped her baby with her trunk, examining every inch to assure herself that no harm had come to it. The baby elephant pressed against its mother, clearly as relieved as she was. But then something happened that would remain etched in the Harrison family's memory forever. Instead of immediately leading her baby away from the area where it had been trapped, the mother elephant turned toward the human family. For several long moments, she studied each of them with those intelligent ancient eyes. Then she approached Robert, the one who had engineered the rescue. The massive female elephant, who could have easily harmed him if she had chosen to, instead gently extended her trunk and touched his forehead. The touch was incredibly gentle, almost reverent, and lasted for nearly 30 seconds. It was unmistakably a gesture of gratitude, performed with the kind of ceremony that suggested deep emotional significance. She repeated this gesture with Margaret, touching her forehead and then her hands, as if acknowledging her role in the rescue. With Jessica, the interaction was even more remarkable. The mother elephant seemed to understand that Jessica had taken the greatest risk by descending into the trap. She touched Jessica's head, then gently wrapped her trunk around the young woman's shoulders in what could only be described as an elephant embrace. But the most extraordinary moment came when the baby elephant, apparently following its mother's lead, approached Jessica and pressed its small trunk against her leg. The baby then moved to each of the human family members, offering its own gesture of thanks. The intelligence and emotional sophistication required for such behavior challenged everything the Harrisons thought they knew about animal cognition. The other two adult elephants, who had maintained their protective positions throughout the rescue, now approached as well. One of them, using her trunk with remarkable precision, carefully gathered a collection of wildflowers and small branches and deposited them at Margaret's feet. The other elephant performed a similar ritual with Robert, offering what appeared to be a formal gift of forest vegetation, arranged with what seemed like deliberate artistic intention. The entire ceremony lasted nearly an hour. The elephants seemed reluctant to leave, as if they wanted to ensure that the humans understood the depth of their gratitude. The mother elephant repeatedly returned to touch each family member, while the baby elephant played near their feet, apparently no longer afraid of human contact. Eventually, the mother elephant made the decision that it was time to leave. She gathered her baby and began leading the small group toward the deeper forest. But at the edge of the clearing, she stopped and turned back one final time. The look she gave the Harrison family seemed to carry a promise that this moment, this connection between species, would not be forgotten. As the elephants disappeared into the forest, their forms gradually swallowed by the green shadows of the trees, the Harrison family stood in stunned silence. They had come to Thailand seeking rest and cultural enrichment, but instead they had been given something far more valuable, a glimpse into the emotional and intellectual complexity of one of Earth's most magnificent species. The experience fundamentally changed their retirement plans. Instead of completing their planned tour of Southeast Asia and returning to their quiet life in Oregon, they found themselves drawn deeper into the world of elephant conservation. Robert's engineering expertise was badly needed by local conservation groups who were working to remove old traps and snares from the forest. Margaret's medical background proved invaluable in establishing first aid protocols for wildlife encounters. Jessica made the decision to change her career focus entirely. Instead of the small animal practice she had originally planned, she began specializing in wildlife veterinary medicine, with particular emphasis on Asian elephants. The experience of looking into that baby elephant's eyes while surrounded by its family's protective love had shown her where her true calling lay. 6 months later, the Harrison family had established a permanent presence in northern Thailand, working with local conservation groups and international wildlife organizations. Robert used his engineering skills to design better water systems for elephant habitats and safer barriers to protect both elephants and local communities. Margaret established wildlife first aid training programs for local rangers and villagers. Jessica completed her veterinary degree with a focus on elephant medicine and behavior. Their lodge room became a base of operations for activities they never could have imagined during their original retirement planning. Maps covered the walls, marking locations of known elephant herds, old trap sites that needed clearing, and water sources that required protection during dry seasons. Their email correspondence, once focused on travel destinations and restaurant recommendations, now included updates from elephant researchers across Southeast Asia and coordination with wildlife protection agencies. But the most meaningful change came exactly 2 years after the rescue. While working on a water system project in a section of forest about 10 kilometers from their original encounter, Robert noticed movement in the tree line. As he watched, a small group of elephants emerged into the clearing where he was working. Leading the group was a female elephant with distinctive markings that he recognized immediately. Behind her walked a young elephant, now tall and strong, with only the slightest limp in its front leg as evidence of its earlier ordeal. The mother elephant saw Robert and, instead of turning away, deliberately approached. What followed was another ceremony of recognition. The mother elephant touched Robert with her trunk, then called to her offspring. The young elephant, now nearly as tall as Robert, approached and repeated the gesture its mother had taught it 2 years earlier. For several minutes, the elephant family and the human engineer stood together in the forest clearing, connected by a bond that transcended the normal boundaries between species. Margaret and Jessica arrived on the scene just as the elephants were preparing to leave. The reunion was joyful on both sides. The elephants clearly remembered each of the humans who had participated in the rescue, and they took time to acknowledge each family member individually. The young elephant, now confident and healthy, played briefly near Jessica's feet, just as it had as a baby after its rescue. But perhaps the most moving moment came when the mother elephant approached Margaret and placed something at her feet. Using her trunk with careful precision, she deposited a piece of wood, carefully selected and polished smooth by handling. It was clearly intended as a gift, chosen and prepared with the same care that a human might use in selecting a meaningful present. As the elephants disappeared back into the forest, the Harrison family realized that their retirement adventure had become something much more significant. They had not simply rescued a baby elephant, they had become part of an ongoing relationship between two species, connected by mutual respect and demonstrated kindness. The piece of wood that the mother elephant had given to Margaret became the centerpiece of their jungle headquarters. They had it examined by local craftsmen, who identified it as a piece of precious heartwood from a tree that only grew in the deepest, most protected parts of the forest. The time and effort required to locate, extract, and polish such a piece suggested planning and intention that challenged conventional understanding of animal behavior. Their story eventually reached international conservation circles, not just as a rescue tale, but as evidence of the sophisticated emotional intelligence of elephants. Researchers from around the world came to interview the Harrison family and to study the ongoing relationship between the family and the elephant herd they had helped. But for Robert, Margaret, and Jessica, the scientific implications, while important, were secondary to the personal transformation they had experienced. They had discovered that retirement, rather than being an ending, could be a beginning. They had learned that the boundaries between species, while real, were more permeable than they had ever imagined. Most importantly, they had found that a single moment of compassion could reshape not just one life, but many. The baby elephant they had rescued grew into a healthy adult and eventually had babies of its own. The herd that had watched over the rescue became frequent visitors to the conservation areas where the Harrison family worked. Over the years, the relationship between the human family and the elephant community deepened, with multiple generations on both sides participating in what had become an ongoing interspecies friendship. Looking back, the Harrisons often reflected on how a simple cry for help in the early morning forest had redirected the entire trajectory of their lives. They had thought they were embarking on a pleasant retirement adventure, but instead they had discovered their life's true purpose. The elephants had given them far more than they had given in return, not just the privilege of making a difference, but the opportunity to participate in something larger than themselves. In the end, the measure of their experience wasn't just in the successful rescue of one baby elephant, remarkable though that was. It was in the ongoing relationship that rescue had sparked, the conservation work it had inspired, and the deeper understanding it had provided about the connections possible between different forms of life. They had learned that kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond the moment of action, and that the willingness to help in a time of crisis can open doorways to experiences that transform everyone involved. The forests of northern Thailand continued their ancient cycles, but within that timeless rhythm, something new had been added, a partnership between species based on mutual respect and demonstrated care. The Harrison family had become part of the forest's story, just as the elephants had become part of theirs. In helping to save one small life, they had discovered that the greatest adventures begin not with plans and itineraries, but with the simple decision to answer when life calls for help.